Welcome to the Darkstream, Vox Day, voxday.blogspot.com. Welcome to the reprehensibles. Welcome to the unauthorized. Welcome to the VFM. And welcome to the Bears. I don't think anybody is watching this at the moment because I just went and fired it up without notification and without warning because I did a little test on the unauthorized streaming, and unfortunately it was, as far as I can tell, a complete bust. So we're going to have to keep working with that and seeing what's going on there. But c'est la vie, no problem. Okay, looks like some of you have heard about this has started, so thanks for tuning in. Sorry I couldn't make it last night, but just a little busy working on some of our big projects that we're going to be announcing very soon. Anyhow, the cowardice of the collective. What am I talking about there? You know, Owen Benjamin said something in a conversation with me the other day that really kind of got me thinking. And I was thinking about it in the context of a book I've been reading, which is Hooking Up by Tom Wolfe. And the book is much, much more interesting than I had ever imagined, because I was under the impression that it was, I think I was confusing it with the Charlotte Simmons book, which was all about college campuses and so forth. Now, I think that he probably gets to that point at some point, but you know, I'm a fair ways in, and he's actually spending a lot more time talking about the development of the transistor and the semiconductor, the establishment of companies like Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel, and even delving into evolutionary biology, E.O. Wilson, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, neuroscience, and so forth. It's really a bit of a tour de force, and very reminiscent of his book, The Right Stuff. It's much more, so far, it's much more akin to The Right Stuff than it is to something like The Bonfire of the Vanities, which I was not a fan of. But the interesting thing is he's talking about the belief, Wolfe is describing the belief of modern biologists and modern scientists that a lot of our actions and decisions and thinking is essentially pre-programmed by our genetics. Most scientists in those fields are actually much more extreme and much more radical than you tend to pick up in the popular science journals and so forth, because they have to be cautious. You know, they step a little too far over the line, and the social scientists and the politicians and the activists all come down on them like a ton of bricks. But the reality is that they actually believe that there really is no self, there really is no consciousness, and that we are essentially all pre-programmed insects going about our roles in much the same way that the insects that E.O. Wilson originally studied behave. Now, obviously, I don't accept that. I think that they've simply completely failed to grasp anything beyond the material. They're looking for something that they can't find because they're looking for it in the wrong way and in the wrong places. But that doesn't mean that they're completely wrong. That doesn't mean that we aren't pre-programmed by our genes in some ways. And this is what relates to what Owen said. He talked about how people of Northern descent need to get the hell over the idea that if they don't go along with the crowd, they're going to freeze to death. A lot of people have wondered, why on earth are the Scandinavians so cocked? Why on earth are the Europeans and the Americans, who are predominantly of of European descent, why are they so hopelessly, haplessly trusting? We live in some of the only societies that in all of history have ever allowed themselves to be voluntarily invaded by people from other societies. And yes, we have the stupid ideologies, we have the ridiculous intellectuals justifying these things, offering rational justification, but that's dialectic. All the arguments in the world wouldn't do you any good to try to convince the Chinese to allow 300 million Africans or Europeans or anyone else to move in and take over. Wolf even mentions, and he phrases it as if it's a praiseworthy thing, but you can sense the deep sarcasm and disbelief underneath. He talks about how no other societies on Earth have ever let other people just come in and start dictating how the people who are already there should live. All you need to do is move enough people, import enough people into a specific town, and they make the rules. This is absolutely insane. This is something that can't possibly work over time because of the different way that different peoples prefer to live. If Americans are not imposing their traditions and their culture and their language and their laws on immigrants, then by definition, those immigrants, having arrived in sufficient number, will be imposing them on the Americans who were there before. And so why do people not just allow this, but go along with it so peacefully, so without even verbal resistance, without even questioning it? And the reason is because, one potential reason is because over the centuries, surviving in places where you need other people, where without the support of the tribe, the family, etc., you will die. It has encouraged this collective mentality that in some ways is a big assistance. It's a big help. One of the things that I was reading about was the way that Google's culture was established by a bunch of men, mostly white, and that culture is now being exploited and perverted by the very diversity that they brought in. And what's interesting is that that's actually a descendant, a successor of the same principle that began with the original establishment of the companies in Silicon Valley, beginning with Intel and a guy by the name of Noyce, who was one of the founders of Intel. And Wolf traces back the foundation of Silicon Valley culture to the Midwestern Christian congregationalism, of Grinnell, Iowa, of all places. And it's not just related to the ethnicity of the people of Grinnell, Iowa. See, Grinnell, Iowa was actually founded as a specifically religious town as part of the Congregationalist Christian faith. And so it had this very egalitarian ethic, very hardworking, very intellectually and educationally ambitious. And what was fascinating was that at the time, in the 50s, Grinnell was actually far more advanced when it came to the new science of transistors and what laid the foundations for the computer industry. It was actually far more advanced than MIT, much less Caltech. I mean, we're talking about years ahead. It took MIT it took MIT decades to catch up to Grinnell. And what happened was these guys moved out to California and they set up a very different corporate culture, a much more egalitarian one that was much less hierarchical than the big corporations out east. And this was very conscious. They were consciously rejecting the way that the Eastern corporations were established and organized. And so, to me, it's really remarkable to see to see the way in which that very specific Christian European culture established itself, flowered, but then attracted people from all over the world, none of whom shared that heritage, those values, that faith, etc. And how quickly the whole thing has gone to hell. But again, we see, why did the men of Intel and all these various companies that grew up around that culture that was originally established by Intel, how did they wind up inviting in so many people whose values and traditions were not merely incompatible, but were actively hostile to the very values that made it work in the first place? Now, I suspect and I believe that the main reason is that but he does talk specifically about how the abandonment of their Christianity had a real impact on the ability of those men whose attitudes had been formed by it to pass it on. You know, if you get raised in a Christian home and your parents teach you about the Bible, they take you to church, they teach you to pray, they teach you certain values and stuff, those things tend to stick with you even if you walk away from the church, even if you give up your faith. But what tends to happen is that you break the chain, and your children will not have that same core base that made you successful in the first place. And I think that is true of nations as well as people. It's true of families as well as individuals. And that's why it's so important to apply those things, to adopt those practices and traditions of your heritage, because what it's part of what makes you you. Now that's in contradiction, of course, to what we were talking about with regards to the genetic influences. Because if you look at the genetic influences, it seems like Europeans just have a fundamentally difficult time not welcoming people in general. And they have a very, very difficult time going against whatever the ruling social ethic is. Now, who knows? Why is it so easy for someone like me to go against the social ethic? Is it because I'm mixed race? Because I never really fit in anywhere I ever was? Is it my genetic Indian coming out? I mean, who knows? I have no idea. But what I do know is that in the same way that an atheist is just fundamentally missing the ability to believe in God, I am fundamentally missing the need to go along with whatever the social ethic is. There's a lot of people who, when seeing five lights, feel a strong pressure to say four if everybody else is saying four. They've done the experiments, in fact, where in an entire class of people will be told to measure two strings, and one of which is longer than the other. And it's kind of amazing how many people will tell the researchers that the shorter string is longer, or that the longer string is shorter, as long as other people in the room are doing that. They will, rather than trust their own eyes, they will go along with the narrative that the dominant social ethic is pushing. Of course, it's funny because there are, when I was reading about the study, there are a certain type of personality that simply will not do that. Like, it doesn't matter if the entire class. I just find it interesting that when you look at these people, and when you look at these situations like Silicon Valley being invaded and then transformed, when you look at, even on a smaller scale, a company like Google having its corporate culture transformed by virtue of the people it's chosen to hire, you wonder why the collective is too cowardly to maintain itself. And so we have these different theories, but we don't actually know. I don't actually know, and it's something that I spend a fair amount of time thinking about as somebody who's created a community. How do we maintain it? For example, with the chat, we were not able to successfully maintain it because people who are not part of our culture wanted to come in and wanted to transform it. Now, I wasn't willing to let them do that, so I shut the whole thing down. When we get to 30,000 subscribers, then we can open it up again, but only to those whose behavior, values, ethics are compatible with this community's. If they're not, they have to be excluded. They can't take part. And that's the thing I think that is it seems so difficult for Europeans to understand, is that everyone can't take part. Everyone doesn't belong. When you have competing interests, competing cultures, it's not necessarily possible within the organization, within the community, whatever you want to call it itself. It's not necessarily compatible. And so it's important to police your borders. It's important to guard your borders. And even in the Bible, they talk about the importance of doing that. To watch out for the wolves in sheep's clothing and so forth. And I find it a little bit astonishing and a little bit remarkable that so many people pay no attention to that. So, anyhow, that's all I want to say about the collective. I'll say more about the foundation of Silicon Valley and the way that it's been perverted over time after I read further into the book. But I do want to mention a couple other things. First of all, the legend Chuck Dixon now has a second video up on Unauthorized, and it is on the character that he created, the very famous character he created by the name of Bane. And he's talking about what went into that, why the character was created, and some interesting trivia about that process. And we're also got something that we're going to be putting up tomorrow, and that is the new Barcelona Life. Jamon. And this one's really good, and it really makes you want to go back to Barcelona. That, of course, is an amazing amount. You would not believe how much all that pata negra would cost you if you were to try to buy all of it. But it's just phenomenal stuff, and looking forward to getting that video up. So anyhow, that's all I've got for tonight. Sorry about the failed experiment with the direct to unauthorized streaming, but we're going to keep working on that, see what's going on, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Darkstream. I'm Vox Day.